Sometimes a story arises that doesn't seem to fit the narrative. And of course the narrative is our exploration into what it means to be human. But stories are like burps or sneezes or coughs when they arise. You can't deny them. So let's see what this Indian folk tale that has arisen invokes for us. It's about a daughter-in-law whose husband was a very weak man because he'd been subdued by a very tyrannical mother since birth. But as a mother-in-law, she was even far, far worse. She beat her daughter-in-law unmercifully. She made her go out and clean the animal sheds and then cook the meals and clean the house. And when she did cook and provide for her and her son, they would eat the meal and leave her only the scraps. She would always be abused, being called worthless and a whore and all kinds of things, never letting her rest from the tirade of her abuse. But as it happened, outside the window of their house, there was what is called a gourd vine. And this vine produced these delicious gourds once in a season, and everyone coveted them because they made the most wonderful dishes, traditional dishes, in the Indian style. So there came a time when these gourds were ripe, and the mother-in-law took them in, and she herself, not trusting the daughter-in-law, was cooking a delicious dish of the gourds for herself and her son, and she'd sent off the daughter-in-law to town to do the shopping. But when the daughter-in-law came back, when she got to the door, she was calling her mother-in-law, mother-in-law, and of course the old woman abused her. "What are you screaming about, you worthless piece of trash?" And the daughter-in-law said, "Oh, mother-in-law, I met your sister's husband in town, and she said that your sister is very, very ill and really wants to see you." So, of course, the mother-in-law starts to cry, "Oh, my dear sister, what's happened to her? I have to go to her straight away." "Well, you take over cooking the gourds now. You take over and until I get back." So off the mother-in-law went, leaving the daughter-in-law to stir the pot of gourd goulash that was being made. But the smell of this was so aromatic, and of course the daughter-in-law, always being hungry, really, really would love to eat this goulash. So she got some more gourds and she put it into the tureen to cook up, and then she put aside a tureen for herself. So before the mother-in-law came home, the daughter-in-law took the tureen of goulash and she went off to the nearby Kali temple. Now there was the statue of Kali standing there in all her majesty. But the daughter-in-law went in and was so longing to eat this goulash that she sat down at the base of the statue and hoed into her bowl, relishing every mouthful, slurping it up. But without noticing, the statue of Kali suddenly put her hand to her mouth. Now the daughter-in-law didn't even notice. She finished her goulash and went home to receive the terrible, terrible beating that awaited her from her mother-in-law, who called her all types of terrible, terrible names, calling her a hungry, greedy, this and that and the other, and getting a very horrible beating. But it soon came to the sight, and all the ears of the people in town, what had happened to the statue of Kali. Now, Kali had her hand in her mouth. It was obviously a dreadful, dreadful sign. Something awful had happened, or something awful was going to happen in the town, because Kali now had her hand in her mouth. Well, when the daughter-in-law heard about this, she said to her mother-in-law, "Mother-in-law, I can make Kali take her hand out of her mouth." And of course, again, the old woman decried her and said, "What do you want to bring bad names onto us? Who do you think you are? What do you think you can do?" But the daughter-in-law insisted and insisted, until finally the mother-in-law said, all right, go on. So the daughter-in-law took to the temple her broom. And of course people came wanting to see what was going on, but the daughter-in-law would not let anyone else in the temple but herself, and she closed the door behind her, and then she went to the foot of Kali's statue, and she said, "Are you going to take your hand out of your mouth, or do I have to beat you to do it?" But there was no reply from Kali. So the daughter-in-law took her broom and gave her Kali's statue a big beating, and the statue just let out, "Oi, ya, ya," and took her hand out of her mouth. Well, of course, all the town knew what was happening and lauded the daughter-in-law as being some kind of wonderful being that was able to bring this about. And of course, the mother-in-law was absolutely scared out of her mind because she thought that her daughter-in-law had some powers, and my goodness, what they'd done to her over all of these. What would she do to them if she wanted to take revenge on them, she and her ne'er-do-well son? So one moment when the daughter-in-law was out doing some cleaning, the mother-in-law said to the son, "Son, we have to get rid of her. You don't know what she's going to do to us. What can we do?" And he said, "Oh, mother, I don't know. What do you think?" And so the mother-in-law said, "Well, we'll tie her up and we'll take her out to the cemetery ground and we'll burn her at the gates." So they made their plan that they would tie her up when she was asleep and wrap her up in her sleeping mat and carry her down to the cemetery ground. Well, carrying out their plan, they did just that, but of course the daughter-in-law woke up midst of this, and although she didn't know what was going on, she played quiet and a little bit dead as they carried her off. But when they got to the cemetery ground, of course they had to put their bundle down so they could go and find some kindling wood to make the fire. So while they were off, the daughter-in-law was able to free herself from her bondage and climb out of the bedding that she was wrapped in, and climb a banyan tree. But before doing so, she found a log to put inside the wrapping that they had put around her. So when they came back, of course, they set the fire, and they sat beside it while the fire grew up, and they could hear all the crackling that was going on. And suddenly there was a great pop, and the mother-in-law said, "Oh yes, that's the head popping, and that's a sign that the burning is already over." So they left the fire to burn down. And here was the daughter-in-law up the banyan tree, and she thought she better wait there for a while until they were well out of sight and well away. But as she was sitting up in the tree, 4 robbers came by with all the loot that they'd just taken from a rich man's house, and sat under her tree to share out all their misgotten gains. And so the daughter-in-law sat quietly in the tree watching what was going on. Then all of a sudden one of the robbers heard something in the distance, and they thought, oh, I wonder what that is. I wonder if somebody's coming to get us. You better climb the tree and see if you can see if there's anybody there. So one of the robbers climbed the tree, and of course as he climbed the tree he came face to face with the daughter-in-law, didn't he? And he was very scared. And he said, well, who are you? And the daughter-in-law said, well, I'm a celestial being. And she said, now that you've come up into my tree, that means you have to marry me. So we have to consummate our marriage. You better kiss me. So he came over to her to reach out for her, and of course, I don't know whether Indians do this, but he put his tongue out. And so she bit it off. He fell down the tree, of course, with blood streaming out of his mouth and screaming like a banshee, which made the other 3 robbers run off like banshees too, leaving all their loot behind. So, of course, the daughter-in-law climbed down from the tree and gathered up all the loot that had been left behind, and went back to her house, where she knocked on the door. Mother-in-law, mother-in-law. And of course the mother-in-law came to the door, went white and fainted. And when she came to, what happened? What are you? And the daughter-in-law said, well, I was taken up by Yama, the god of death, but when I went with him, he said, you know, you really don't belong here. It's your mother-in-law that should be punished. But I begged for you. I said, really, she's really at heart, she's a good woman. Don't do that. So he let me come back, and he gave me all these jewels, just because of whatever. So after that, of course, the daughter-in-law became the head of the house. The mother-in-law and her husband became totally and absolutely subservient to her, and they all lived peacefully from then on. Has this story got anything to do with being human? Or what does it bring up for us? What do you see as its deep meaning? What does it evoke for us? As all stories must do, like any interaction we have with anything, bringing previously a reaction, but at the very least a response. What is our response to this Indian folk tale? We can't really say up the women, because there's a mother-in-law and Mother Kali, isn't it? What is its deep meaning.
Well, you know, for me,